Very recently, THQ Nordic revealed a few new upcoming games during their digital showcase. Among those mentioned, one stood out for me as I'm sure it did for many others. A new entry for an older gaming franchise that is long overdue. A reimagining of Alone in the Dark. So this may seem just like another survival horror title, which it is. However, I consider the Alone in the Dark franchise to be a very important early addition to the horror genre. Here's a little history on the series. The very first game, simply titled Alone in the Dark, was released way back in 1992 on magnetic floppy disks for Microsoft DOS, or MS-DOS, and later on CD-ROM. The MS-DOS version spans several disks and is actually the very first 3D survival horror game, can you believe it? This claim can even be backed up by Guinness World Records, who gave it that accolade in 2008. In fact, it had an influence on Shinji Mikami's Resident Evil. This is not to say it was a better or more refined game than Resident Evil, but it should get its due credit. Knowing the background to this genre might prevent some players from viewing Alone in the Dark Remake as one more Resident Evil clone, which it is not. It was, after all, the very first horror game to use dramatic camera angles which give the perspective that the player is watching the scene unfold from a corner high up on the wall. Something that was used in the later Resident Evil. Alone in the Dark drew on iconic Lovecraftian lore which adapted well to the low poly monsters. The levels play out very much like a Resident Evil game, which illustrates how that basic framework can function room to room without demanding a lot of memory. The developers had intended to use actual images of a real mansion for the game's backgrounds, but of course the technology wasn't powerful enough at that time, so they opted for hand-drawn polygons instead. By using realistic graphics as we currently can, we can now depict Alone in the Dark as it was intended. The plot is set in 1924 down south in Louisiana. The obligatory haunted mansion is owned by an artist named Jeremy Hartwood, who has committed suicide, and Edward is tasked to find out why. As a grimy private investigator, Edward Carnby is hired by a woman named Gloria to investigate Mr. Hartwood's death, although police had already closed the case. Carnby eagerly took the case, being both drawn to valuables and unafraid of ghosts or demons. Despite his dapper appearance with a bow tie and ginger mustache, his intro describes him as an ego-driven tough guy who sometimes goes by the nickname The Reptile. As for the other playable main character, Emily Hartwood's story begins with very different motives, as she is Jeremy's niece, and so wants to know more about why her uncle hanged himself. For a DOS game, one might expect her to play exactly the same, but there are some differences in mechanics. For example, she can run slightly faster than Edward, but cannot kick due to her tight skirt. Alone in the Dark 2 built on the first title without wasting much time. Just 1 year later, in 1993, the sequel came out with a greater emphasis on gunfighting. These battles made the game more difficult, but players evidently didn't seem to mind, as Resident Evil would successfully implement similar gameplay later on. Alone in the Dark 3 was the last in the franchise to use the original game engine. In 1994, technology was already changing. A couple years later, a version of Alone in the Dark 3 would be released on Windows 95, but later titles would begin to shift from PC to consoles. PlayStation and Dreamcast were designed for playing games, not making spreadsheets, and they would take future games in the direction of controllers rather than keyboards. The Alone in the Dark remake intends to revisit the original game and incorporate elements from the original trilogy while borrowing heavily from the Resident Evil style that developed from it. More specifically, the Resident Evil 2 remake. Instead of the fixed camera angles, we're getting an over-the-shoulder camera and a bigger focus on combat. If any game has the right to do so, it's Alone in the Dark. The fans have certainly been waiting long enough. With the first 3 games coming out within a year of each other, it's already been 30 years, with most of the changes to the genre being graphical improvements. We still want to push statues, unlock doors, and blast monsters with triple-barreled shotguns. In 1992, developers could only dream of realistic water and lighting effects with reflections and ray tracing, not to mention audio quality that an old Sound Blaster card could never produce. The story will be penned by Mikhail Hedberg, former Frictional Games writer who had worked on games such as Penumbra: Black Plague, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and Soma. I got a chance to play a little bit of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, but didn't get very far. Soma, on the other hand, I thoroughly enjoyed. The story for this new Alone in the Dark game will involve the two original characters, Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood. While the setting will be the same as the first game, the story will be a mash of the three games in the trilogy. Sadly, I never got a chance to play the original games way back when. My first game in the series was actually the fourth game, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, on Sega Dreamcast, which was actually the first reboot of the series. By this point, I had already played a few Resident Evil games, the latest being Resident Evil Code Veronica. Graphically, The New Nightmare had some drastic improvements. The frame rate was much higher than the PS1 version. It felt more like playing a PC game. You had a choice of playing one of two characters, and depending on which character you chose, determined the type of gameplay experienced. Choosing to play as Edward Carnby focused on more action and killing monsters. Choosing the character, Aline Sedrak, had you focus more on puzzles. The character wielded flashlights that worked well in the dark environments. The atmosphere was damn creepy as hell. This entry continued the Lovecraft-inspired story, which I found to be even deeper than any Resident Evil game I played. This game was self-contained and not connected to the previous entries, nor did it connect with the future ones, aside from the main character, Edward Carnby. Instead of the setting taking place during the early 1900s, this one took place in the modern timeline of October 2001. It was fun playing a game that took place just a few months from its release date. I won't mention any games that came after this, as the quality only goes down from here. The series has been grossly mishandled and has been tarnished. I'm hoping this reimagining is enough to bring the series back to life as it deserves it. I always say, you shouldn't spit on the past, and that definitely applies to this series. Looking back, Alone in the Dark 4, The New Nightmare, is actually one of the earlier Lovecraftian stories I got to experience, if not the first. Perhaps a year or two later, I got to play Eternal Darkness, which is heavily influenced by it. Video games have come a long way. While they still get some disrespect and blame for society's woes, they are starting to get taken really seriously these days. During a worldwide pandemic, video games helped keep us sane. They are far more than flashing lights and bleep bloops. As new games come out, we get some new stories and some familiar ones. Hopefully, the new Alone in the Dark will make history again. As always, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. I hope you're as excited for this game as I am. Though we don't have a release date, hopefully it'll be by the end of the year. Stay safe, everyone, and until next time.